Hello, my name is Tim Hubner. I serve as the chair of the board of editors of the Journal of Supreme Court History. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you and to interview Professor Craig Allen Smith, who is a professor of history and political science at Pennsylvania Western University. He is currently writing a biography of Justice Tom C. Clark, and the reason for our interview here today is he's just had an award-winning piece that came out in the Journal of Supreme Court History last year. This is in volume 46, number 1 of the 2021 sequence of issues in the journal. The title of his article is Make Way for Tomorrow: How Justice Tom C. Clark Departed from and Almost Returned to the Supreme Court. This article was the winner of the Hughes-Gossett Prize for the outstanding article published in the Journal of Supreme Court History in volume 46. So it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Craig Allen Smith. Welcome.
Hello, and thank you, Professor Hubner, for having me. It was quite a surprise and a distinct pleasure to receive notification that I had won the Hughes-Gossett Prize, which is, something of a highlight of my scholarship at this point.
Well, it's certainly a wonderful piece, an excellent piece, and we're going to take a few moments here today to talk about it. But I did want to mention that it's not the first time that Professor Smith has published in our journal, in that he is working on this larger project, biography of Justice Clark, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end. But let's start with the article. Maybe you could explain what you wrote about and why, and what this whole episode is that you sort of chronicle here in this piece.
Well, let's begin with the tape recordings. There are a collection of White House tape recordings in the Johnson administration that I downloaded and had access to so that I could listen to these telephone conversations that the president was having with a whole collection of advisors about judicial appointments. And I was listening to these in the context of trying to learn why Tom Clark left the court. And it's a well-known story that Tom Clark made the decision in 1967 to step down because President Johnson was about to appoint his son, Ramsey Clark, to be the Attorney General of the United States. And it made for a very heartwarming story. The father is prepared to step down for the sake of his son to advance his political career. And that's how the narrative usually is told. And of course, everybody knows, if you follow the Supreme Court, that this became an opportunity for Lyndon Johnson then to fulfill his civil rights agenda by appointing the first African-American justice in Thurgood Marshall. So the arc of the story seems inevitable. It seems to be well played by all the participants. But then I discovered when listening to the White House tapes, it wasn't at all certain what was going to happen. There was a great deal of concern over whether it could happen. There was a lot of miscommunication over who knew what. And when did they know it? And were they prepared to discuss it? And I thought, oh, there's a lot more here than the feel-good narrative of the father stepping down to advance his son's career so that Johnson could make this historic appointment. And that was really the reason why I thought the article merited attention, because these White House tapes have an awful lot of contextual clues as to what was really happening.
Yes, absolutely. And the footnotes are very rich with citations to those White House tapes. And so tell us a little bit more about that. Tell us more about Johnson and how he thought that he could make this work, but there were moments when it looked like it wasn't going to work out. And as you say, a lot of contingency here in this whole story.
Right. And to sort of back up and set up what Johnson was trying to accomplish here, of course, he'd already manipulated the court in a way to put his good friend Abe Fortas on the court. So this was very much in his character. And when it was time to find a replacement for Attorney General after Bobby Kennedy stepped down in that role to run for the US Senate, he made Nick Katzenbach the acting Attorney General. So this was all very much in his character. Put somebody in place as a sort of a place card, hold that position, acting Attorney General, see how it works out. Well, there was no way of knowing that the pieces would fall into place until Katzenbach decided he was going to step down as Attorney General for a number of different reasons. And all of a sudden, the opportunity presented itself. What might happen if Ramsey Clark, then serving as Deputy Attorney General, became the acting Attorney General? And how might the dominoes fall if Ramsey then became the Attorney General? So there's where the first contingency comes into play is, well, is Johnson then obligated to make the acting Attorney General the Attorney General? And so that's where you start to see the wheels turning in these conversations that he's having with political operatives on Capitol Hill. He's talking to members of the US Senate Judiciary Committee. He's talking to good friends, Republicans that he has in Congress, whether or not they can support Ramsey to be the Attorney General. And while all of this is taking place, he's also having conversations with his good friend Abe Fortas on the court, talking about, well, what might this mean for the Supreme Court? Will this be the opportunity that we need to move Tom Clark off the court? And nobody really knew what anybody would decide. Nobody knew what Johnson would decide to do, because when you look at Ramsey Clark as Attorney General, he was not a good fit for Lyndon Johnson. But when you look at the opportunity that it presented to Lyndon Johnson to somehow manage the personnel on the court a second time, it became almost irresistible. He just didn't know how to make it work or who would be the communicator, if you will, the inside person to get word to Ramsey. This is what we want to do. Get word to Tom. This is what we want to do. Convince the bar and the rest of the court that this is not only appropriate, but necessary. That was the real trick for Johnson. And so all of that comes into play.
Yes, excellent. And if I could just pick up on a few of the things you've mentioned. So you mentioned that Johnson had already manipulated the sort of court in order to get Fortas there. So remind us then, Goldberg had been on the court. Johnson names him ambassador to the United Nations. Is that right? And then
Right.
Fortas is named to take Goldberg's place on the court. So that has already happened. So Fortas is there on the court. And as you point out, Fortas serves as a sort of mole. He's talking to the White House through all of this, right?
Exactly. And that was, of course, one of the pleasures of relying on other historians who have delved deeply into the Johnson presidency, the Fortas affair, the Goldberg replacement. These were not part of those taped conversations, but when you can rely on other historians who have already delved into this and sort of revealed how these things transpired in the Johnson White House. I'll never forget reading, because I always thought, of course, that Johnson was the political manipulator who convinced Goldberg that it was his duty to serve his country and go to the United Nations and stop the Vietnam War. Until I read a Johnson biography that basically explained from a White House insider perspective that that's what they wanted you to think. Goldberg was actually ready to leave, and Johnson didn't have to twist his arm that hard, but it sure looked good if people believed it. So when you hear things like that, when you read things like that from one other historian's perspective, and then you listen to the tapes, and you hear Johnson talking to Fortas, and you know how much he depends on Fortas, and then you hear him pick up the phone to talk to a member of Congress, And you hear the duplicity because Johnson's saying one thing in a conversation that you just know he's not sharing the whole truth because you just heard a conversation where he said something that contradicts what he's having in a later conversation. Then you begin to wonder just how crafty is he? Who is he telling the truth to? How much of this is just a fishing expedition to see what he can get away with? And then you add to that the layers of what I described as stage directions, right? The shuffling of papers, the long pauses, the change in intonation. And there's all kinds of clues that you don't try to put all of it in the narrative, but you try to suggest that he may have been looking for options, or he may have been feeling his way, because you can hear it in his voice.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Yes, fascinating. And, so this whole question that, your article also raises and is a very interesting one is, would there have been an actual conflict of interest had Tom Clark stayed on the court with his son Ramsey as Attorney General? And, so your article, explains how they're like the father and the son are navigating that issue at the same time that Johnson is trying to navigate it. And of course, Johnson is trying not to put any pressure on Clark, but he's working behind the scenes to try to get Clark to step down. So, tell us about that whole conflict of interest, issue. Would there have been an actual conflict of interest, or is that even relevant here? I mean, is this really more a story about Johnson's machinations and his attempts to sort of manipulate things, or is there real conflict of interest? Maybe you can explain that a little bit more.
Well, the whole idea of the conflict of interest came about because under the law at the time, Tom Clark was not required to recuse himself or sit out of a case if his son became Attorney General. So the prevailing attitude among the bench and the bar, especially among the justices of the court, was that there would be no conflict of interest. Johnson was even receiving this advice from his former Attorney General. He was receiving this advice from members of Congress saying, there is no conflict of interest, particularly when you consider that as the Attorney General, Ramsey Clark would have been further removed from the Supreme Court than he was as an Assistant Attorney General, for example, a position he held for 4 years that didn't seem to present a conflict of interest. It presented the same conflict of interest he would have had when he served as Deputy Attorney General, which turned out to be almost as long as he served for Attorney General. And Tom Clark didn't step down for that, or frankly, didn't even recuse himself from cases that Ramsey may have been responsible for. I'll never forget reading an interview that Ramsey did after all of this took place, where Ramsey came right out and said, I was much closer to cases as an Assistant Attorney General, and my dad still sat on them. So, with all of this taking place at the time, I'm not sure you could say that there was a legitimate conflict of interest, which seemed to be one of the biggest roadblocks that Johnson had to overcome, which is why he needed to create the perception of a conflict of interest. And that was the real hook. When he finally found that in his vocabulary, that the ordinary average person who doesn't understand the law, who doesn't understand the role of the Solicitor General, who cannot understand why this matters when President Kennedy had his brother serve as Attorney General, right? This father-son conflict Johnson presented to everybody who wanted to say there's no conflict of interest. He said, don't tell me that the folks in Johnson City aren't going to say that the father is voting for his boy, right?
Right.
And that was what he needed. And that's how he played it every time somebody said, Tom doesn't have to leave the bench. And for a very brief moment, it seemed that Tom was content to stay, even if Ramsey became the Attorney General. And that just threw Johnson into a tailspin. And he was starting to demand of people like Nick Katzenbach, we never gave him any indication that he could stay, did we?
Right, right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's such a fascinating story, so rich with all of these elements and all the human drama and the interaction and the back and forth. And the essay really captures all of that. And at the end of the piece, you talk about another episode, which is the June 1968 announcement by Chief Justice Warren that he was going to retire. And of course, he wanted to retire in such a way as to allow President Johnson to appoint his successor. Of course, we know it didn't turn out that way, but tell us a little bit about that episode in 1968 and what it has to do with Tom Clark.
Well, to set this up, one of the things that I think should be at least presented in the context of Johnson even thinking about Clark and returning him to the Supreme Court is these two Texans have been really good friends for decades. Right. All right. And in some part, that's how Ramsey was able to elevate within the Justice Department, is because the families were very close. They trusted each other. They depended on one another. They were very close personally. And when the Fortas nomination fell through, because what Johnson was hoping to do was elevate Fortas, who was a sitting justice, into the Chief Justice chair. And then he needed a second nomination to fill the Fortas seat. And he put forward two names that he thought would be acceptable to both parties in Congress. Then it all fell through, and it looked like there was just one vacancy, the Chief Justice. So Johnson started teasing out this idea at the 12th hour, when there was no more room left to maneuver because he wasn't running for president in 68. He knew that his term was about to expire. They had fumbled the Fortas nomination, and Fortas had asked them to withdraw it. So he's bantering around these ideas, and you can't tell from the tone of his voice if he's desperate enough to even try it, or if he's just frustrated and looking for answers. But he brings up the name of Tom Clark. And surprisingly, the senator who he's speaking to says, that might just work, because he's already been on the court. We wouldn't even really have to confirm him, would we? Right? And you hear this conversation taking place where it sounds like they're actually taking seriously the idea that, well, yeah, he could come back and just serve as a buffer, serve as kind of an interim Chief Justice. And then if, I think it was Humphrey wins the election, he could appoint the next chief, or if Nixon, the front runner, wins the election, he could appoint the next chief. But we get Clark in there, kind of smooth things over, because as Johnson said, he knows the place, right? And at this point, Clark has been judging all over the country on the lower federal court. So, he hasn't lost his touch for making decisions. He's very much engaged in the judiciary, still running the federal judicial center, et cetera. So the whole idea of bringing Clark back seemed at least plausible. But then the question arises, well, Mr. President, if you're going to do this at the end of your term of office, what does that mean for your Attorney General, Ramsey Clark? Would then he have to step down? Because that's what his father did when you appointed him Attorney General. And they actually had a conversation, would that be right to Ramsey? And this senator points out to the president, you haven't really been happy with your Attorney General. I don't think that's such a bad idea. So now they're talking about Ramsey having to resign so that Tom Clark can come back. And the whole thing was just, eye-opening, jaw-dropping as you're listening to them talking about this.
Fascinating story. Thank you for walking us through some of the details, and as I said, just a very rich, very interesting story that tells us something about the role of the Supreme Court in politics and politics and the Supreme Court. Tells us a lot about President Johnson and his attempts really throughout his time in office to manipulate the Supreme Court. With the few moments that we have left, if you wouldn't mind, Professor Smith, you could tell us a little bit about the larger project, the biography of Justice Clark.
Sure. After the publication of my first book, my first full-length book, which was a biography of Justice Charles Whittaker, I was looking for another opportunity to explore behavior on the court, and just really because I understood the Warren Court the best in terms of Whittaker's failed service there, as you know, his brief 5 years on the bench that came to an ignoble end when he resigned with a disability because he was suffering a nervous breakdown. I started asking myself, well, what would be a good subject that has not yet been fully explored? And if you look at the literature on Supreme Court justices, just about everybody who's ever served with Tom Clark has a full-length biography or receives treatment in some aspect of the court. But Tom Clark and Potter Stewart really don't have anything like a full-length biography. So it was kind of a toss-up. Which way do you want to go? And I decided to go to Austin, Texas, because that's where the Tom Clark papers are housed. And after spending several weeks reading through his correspondence, looking at his court papers, I just found all kinds of gems of material that I thought needed to be told. One of those gems being these White House recordings. Another one, his selection of law clerks, which is another fascinating study, how his law clerk selections changed over time. Another one being his role in certain landmark cases, sometimes that are evident because they've been discussed in other contexts, but at other times they're hidden because there are many instances where Clark wrote an opinion and then put it in a drawer. So you've got all of these unpublished opinions and rough drafts, first drafts, where you can see him working through what his ruling might be. And while I was doing that, then I decided, well, there's so much more to Tom Clark than his service on the court. He was 4 years Harry Truman's Attorney General. He was several years in the Justice Department, where he assisted in the evacuation of Japanese Americans on the West Coast during World War II. And so then you start looking into those archives, and you start delving into the politics of the era and the war that had taken place. And it takes you in so many interesting directions, and he lived through that. So yes, it's a judicial biography, but it's very much a political biography that tells the story of the time in which he lived, because he was influential in a lot of ways.
Certainly. Well, thank you very much. And we will look forward to the biography. And once again, want to thank you for spending time with us today. Once again, the article is Make Way for Tomorrow, How Justice Tom C. Clark Departed from and Almost Returned to the Supreme Court. It's found in volume 46 of the Journal of Supreme Court History. It is volume 46, number 1, and the article is the winner of the Hughes-Gossett Prize for 2021 for the outstanding article published in the Journal of Supreme Court History. Our guest here once again has been Craig Allen Smith, professor of history and political science at Pennsylvania Western University. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us about this wonderful article.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to discuss it with me.
Thanks.